The auction house echoed with laughter, cruel, careless, final. No one wanted the battered German shepherd sprawled on the cold concrete. Labeled unfixable, his fate was sealed. But then, a scarred Marine stood up from the shadows. He saw more than scars. He saw himself. And when he spoke, it wasn't just a bid, it was a declaration. He's coming home with me. What followed would unravel a buried military scandal and prove that even the most broken among us can rise again when someone believes. Where the light finds us. The wind in Maple Hollow didn't whisper. It howled low and mournful, like it remembered things people tried to forget. Snow coated the earth in sheets of silence, erasing paths, softening edges, hiding what once was. It was the kind of cold that settled deep into the bones and stayed there, uninvited. Jacob Reed didn't mind the cold anymore. After what he'd seen overseas, silence and snow were the closest thing to peace. He lived alone now, just him, the hills, and memories that came when the house got too quiet. Some men came home from war to parades, others just disappeared behind barbed wire fences and broken routines. But on a January morning when the sky hung low with stormlight, Jacob would stumble across something left behind, just like him, a dog with dead eyes and a body full of secrets. And neither of them knew it yet, but their encounter would shake the dust off ghosts too long buried and ignite a fight neither had planned to start. The snow fell in heavy, deliberate flakes over Maple Hollow, Wyoming, blanketing the small ranching town in a hush that muffled even the sound of tires over gravel. It was early January, and the sky hung low like a slate lid, threatening to seal the town in silence. The county fairgrounds, usually reserved for rodeos and harvest festivals, had been converted into a livestock auction for the winter concrete floors, buzzing heaters, and the musty scent of hay mingling with diesel and despair. Jacob Reed stood with his shoulders hunched against the cold, hands buried deep in the pockets of his worn Carhartt jacket. At 35, Jacob looked older, weathered, in a way that had nothing to do with years. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, lean but solid, with broad shoulders and hands built for carrying burdens. His hair, once sun-bleached blonde, had grown dark at the roots, and his beard was more salt than pepper now. His eyes, however, were what people remembered: steel, gray, quiet, and filled with a kind of sorrow that made strangers drop their gaze. A former Marine rescue specialist, Jacob had returned from war not with medals, but ghosts. He now kept to himself on the edge of town, tending the remnants of his grandfather's ranch, and speaking to no one unless absolutely necessary. Today, he had no intention of bidding. He had only come to avoid the date that hung heavy on his calendar, the anniversary of the mission that had gone wrong, the one that had taken his brothers and left him with nothing but silence. He thought perhaps the noise of the auction might drown out the memories. He was wrong. The auctioneer's voice echoed off the rafters, sharp and nasal, cutting through the low murmur of cattlemen and traders. Crates of chickens, penned goats, even a few retired horses passed across the stage. Jacob was halfway through his second cup of burnt coffee when the mood in the room shifted. Laughter rippled through the crowd like a cruel wind. "Next up," the auctioneer announced, trying to maintain professionalism though his voice wavered, "lot number 96, former military canine, German Shepherd, no known training certification available. Aggressive, final auction before disposal." From the shadows behind the platform, a man in a gray hoodie tugged a thin leather leash. The dog that emerged was a wreck of what had once been something proud. The German Shepherd was large, maybe 5 years old, with a coat that had dulled from neglectance, black and tan, now mottled and grayed. His right ear stood erect, while the other hung in a half-fold, scarred at the base. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply lay down in the center of the platform, as though waiting for it all to be over. $50, the auctioneer tried again. "Do I hear 50? Someone in the crowd snorted. "Not worth 50 cents. "Damaged goods," another muttered. "Probably turned on his handler. a man in a camouflage ball cap said, shaking his head. Jacob's hand trembled slightly. Not from the cold. It was the eyes, the dog's eyes. Vacant, silent, not afraid but hollow. It was a look he'd seen in the mirror 100 times. It wasn't madness. It was exhaustion of the soul. He stepped forward, the scrape of his chair against the concrete slicing through the laughter. The crowd quieted as he moved toward the auctioneer. "I'll take him," Jacob said, his voice low but carrying. The auctioneer blinked. "Sir, I'm required to inform you's unpredictable. Might be dangerous." "Yeah," Jacob replied. "So am I." There was a pause, then a rustle of whispers. The auctioneer nodded and gestured to the man in the hoodie. Paperwork was passed forward. Jacob signed it without reading. He handed over 2 crumpled bills and took the leash. The man in the hoodie muttered, "Don't say we didn't warn you." The German shepherd didn't move. Jacob knelt slowly, boots crunching against stray straw, and spoke softly. "I don't know what they called you before," he said, "but you're not staying here." Still, the dog didn't respond. A few minutes later, Jacob walked out of the auction house into the falling snow, the leash held loosely in his hand. Behind him, the dog followed at a distance, not from obedience but uncertainty. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it wasn't refusal either. As he opened the passenger door of his old Ford pickup, the dog hesitated. Jacob didn't coax or command. He waited. After a moment, the German shepherd climbed in, turned once in the seat, and lay down without a sound. Jacob drove them home in silence. The only sound was the whisper of snow on glass and the quiet clicking of the dog's claws against the rubber floor mat. The road to his ranch was long and winding, bordered by trees draped in white. By the time they arrived, dusk had begun to settle, coloring the sky in smoky violet. The barn was old but solid, with a single light flickering above the entrance. Jacob led the dog inside, spreading fresh straw in one corner and setting down a bowl of water. He didn't try to pet him. He didn't speak again. He simply sat down on the other side of the barn and watched. The dog curled into the straw, still watching Jacob with the dull stare of something that had been used and discarded. Jacob leaned back against the barn wall, arms crossed over his chest, breath rising in soft clouds. "We'll figure it out," he said, mostly to himself. One broken thing at a time. Outside, the wind picked up again, scattering the snow in small howling swirls. But inside the barn, there was quiet. And for the first time in a long time, neither man nor dog was completely alone. The next morning brought no warmth, only more wind and snowfall. Maple Hollow had frozen overnight, the sun struggling behind thick clouds to cast even a sliver of light. At the edge of town, Jacob Reed stood by the barn door, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the German shepherd, lying curled in the straw. The dog hadn't moved since the night before, save for the occasional twitch of an ear or shift of his tail. The untouched bowl of food and water sat nearby, gathering bits of hay and dust. Jacob had named him Ranger sometime during the silent hours before dawn, not because of his military past, but because of how he moved, like someone who once patrolled something sacred and had lost it. Ranger was tall for a shepherd, with a wide chest and long legs, but his posture was always low, as if waiting for punishment. His fur was a dull patchwork of black and tan, ragged at the haunches. The scars, visible ones and others that lived in the flinch of muscle when boots got too close told of pasts, Jacob didn't need words to understand. Jacob had learned not to push. So he sat again, cross-legged on the cold floor, reading an old paperback he didn't care for, just to be near. No leash, no commands, just presence. He figured if silence had broken the dog, maybe silence could also help mend him. By noon, the wind had eased, and Jacob heard the crunch of tires over frozen gravel. He stood slowly, brushing straw from his jeans, and stepped out into the whitewashed yard. A dusty blue Ford Bronco had parked by the fence, its tires bald, its body pockmarked with rust at the wheel wells. From it stepped a woman in her mid-30s, bundled in a tan field coat 2 sizes too big. She was tall and angular, with high cheekbones and curly auburn hair pulled into a practical ponytail. Her boots were scuffed, her gloved hands quick but careful as she closed the car door and grabbed a medical bag from the back seat. "Dr. Hargrave," Jacob greeted with a nod. "You came quick." "Hard not to when someone says they've got a military shepherd refusing food," she replied, her voice clear and even, like someone used to holding their own in a room full of doubt. Dr. Lily Hargrave had served as a military veterinarian in Kandahar for 5 years before returning to Wyoming to take over her father's small-town animal clinic. She was known across the county not just for her skill, but for her sharp tongue and refusal to tolerate cruelty. She'd once reported a rancher for neglecting a mare and had stood her ground in front of half the town council. People either respected her or avoided her. Either was fine. Jacob opened the barn door without a word. Lily stepped inside, scanning the space. When her eyes landed on Ranger, she froze. Her shoulders dropped a fraction, and her voice softened. "Dear God," she whispered. She moved slowly, crouching several feet from Ranger, careful not to make eye contact. "I know this dog," she said almost to herself. "I treated him once. Fort Hollister K9 program. He was different back then." Jacob stayed quiet, watching her. "We called him Boone," she continued. "He was sharp, responsive, one of the few dogs who didn't flinch at loud noises. He was scheduled for a special ops placement." Her voice grew tight. "And then one day gone. The file said transfer, but I never saw him again. Nobody did." "Do you know what happened to him?" Jacob asked. Lily shook her head. "I've heard rumors. About off-the-record programs. Stress conditioning. They called it enhanced response training." She glanced at Ranger, whose eyes remained on the straw. "But it wasn't training, it was abuse. Dogs that didn't respond correctly disappeared." Jacob's jaw tightened. "You think he was one of them?" "I'd bet my license." She reached slowly into her bag and pulled out a protein supplement disguised as a chew toy. When she placed it gently on the floor and backed away, Ranger sniffed it but didn't touch. She didn't press. "He's dissociating," she said softly. "Still trapped in whatever they did to him. Can he come back from that?" Lily met Jacob's eyes. "Only if he trusts you. And that'll take time, maybe more than you have." "I've got time," Jacob said, simply. Lily stood, brushing off her knees. "Then don't treat him like a dog. Treat him like a soldier, with scars in places you can't see." Before she left, she handed Jacob a small file. "His name might have changed, but some of the microchip data matched what I had from Hollister. See if he responds to the old one." When she was gone, Jacob returned to the barn and sat again across from Ranger. He let the silence stretch until the sky outside turned pale. "Boone," he said gently. Ranger's ears twitched. Jacob didn't smile, didn't speak again. He simply leaned back against the stall wall and waited, the name hanging between them like a forgotten melody. Outside, snow began falling again, light but persistent. The storm wasn't over, but something had shifted. A thread pulled loose from darkness, a name remembered. The wind began to howl late in the afternoon, curling through the trees like a living thing, and by sundown, the storm had swallowed Maple Hollow whole. Snow swept sideways across Jacob's windows, dense and blinding, as if the world outside had vanished. He'd bolted the barn early, spreading extra straw for Ranger, checked the propane levels twice, and tried to prepare for a long, silent night. But by the time he stepped out onto the porch with a mug of black coffee and a flashlight tucked under his arm, Ranger was gone. The gate had been nudged open, not broken, just enough for a body to squeeze through. No paw prints were visible. The storm had already begun to erase them. Jacob stood motionless for a beat, his gut tightening. The barn light flickered behind him, Then he whistled answer, not sharp, not commanding. Just a call. Nothing answered. He grabbed his coat and flashlight, locked the door behind him, and stepped into the dark. 2 hours passed. Snow soaked through his jeans. His breath rasped in his chest. He scanned the trees and gullies near the property line, calling softly, never shouting. Finally, near the base of the ridge, where the land dipped toward the woods, he found track-steep impressions cutting through the drifts. Ranger had gone north. He followed. By the time he found him, Jacob could no longer feel his fingers. The flashlight beam landed on a patch of shadow wedged beneath a rock outcropping, half hidden by pine boughs. Ranger lay curled in a shallow cave, chest heaving, pupils wide and white-rimmed. His body was pressed flat against the stone, ears folded tight, tail tucked so hard it looked painful. Jacob didn't step closer. He just sat down beside the entrance, knees to chest, arms wrapped around himself. The cave smelled of damp earth and old snow. He waited, breathing quietly. After a while, he spoke a nod to soothe, not to coax, just to say something real. "I was 28 when we lost them," Jacob said, his voice low. "Fallujah, dust and blood. One wrong turn, a detonator missed. 8 good men gone in less than a minute. I crawled out of that blast with a hole in my shoulder and silence where my mind used to be." Ranger didn't move, but his eyes flicked toward Jacob, then away. "After the discharge, I came back to Wyoming. Thought I'd fix up the ranch, maybe reconnect with my dad. Found out he'd died 6 months earlier and left behind a bunch of bills and 2 horses no one wanted." Jacob let out a dry laugh. "I didn't cry. I just started fixing the fence." The wind groaned through the trees. Jacob didn't push the silence. He let it live. After another hour, Ranger shifted. Just a paw, then a stretch of his neck. Jacob didn't look at him. He kept his gaze on the trees. Eventually, a cold nose touched his forearm. Light, hesitant. Jacob didn't reach back. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he whispered. "Just asking you to survive." Ranger sat beside him after that, not close, but closer. When they walked home, they didn't speak. Ranger kept to Jacob's left side, head low but no longer shaking. By sunrise, the storm had blown itself out. The world was blanketed in stillness. Later that morning, as Jacob fed the horses and shoveled snow from the porch, a familiar bronco rumbled down the drive. Dr. Lily Hargrave stepped out, her face tight against the wind, one gloved hand gripping a thick envelope. "I got this last night from a friend stationed at Fort Hollister," she said, stepping inside Jacob's kitchen. "It's not supposed to exist." The manila folder looked weathered, but the papers inside were sharp. Service logs, deployment notes, canine incident reports. Ranger's original designation was still partially visible at the top. Boone, MWD, 924. Lily flipped to a page halfway through the packet. "This," she said, laying it flat, "is a field report dated 9 months ago. Boone was assigned to a unit during a patrol mission in Kandahar. They were ambushed. According to this, he broke formation and disobeyed a direct command to advance turn back and tackled one of the Marines out of the line of fire." She tapped a red mark on the page. "The only reason 3 men survived was because of that move. But instead of being commended, the handler filed a disciplinary report, claimed the dog's behavior was erratic. They marked him unfit for further deployment and transferred him off record." Jacob leaned over the table, scanning the handwriting. "They buried it." "They buried everything," Lily said, her voice clipped. "No one would question it. It's just a dog. A broken one at that." Jacob sat back. Except he wasn't broken. He was right. And he paid for it. Lily nodded slowly. "If this is accurate and, I believe it is then someone deliberately erased a hero's record to cover their own mistakes." Jacob's eyes darkened. "Then we don't bury this. We dig." He looked over to where Ranger now lay in the doorway, watching them. His ears perked slightly at Jacob's voice. Not trusting, not healed. but listening. "We'll start with what we have," Jacob said, "and we'll make damn sure the truth sees daylight." 3 days after the snowstorm, the sky over Maple Hollow cleared to a brittle blue, the kind of color that promised cold without comfort. Jacob Reed was mending a broken fence post near the edge of the pasture when a black SUV rolled up the long drive, tires crunching slow and deliberate over frozen dirt. He straightened, squinting as the vehicle came to a stop just short of the porch. The windows were tinted, and the license plate was unfamiliar. No county tags, no state identifiers. 2 men stepped out. The first was tall, well-dressed in a gray wool coat and leather gloves, his hair slicked back in a manner too polished for ranch country. The second was stockier, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt under a military surplus jacket, though his boots were too clean for field work. Both looked out of place, not in the way tourists did, but like people who knew exactly what they were doing. "Mr. Reed?" the tall man asked, voice smooth, professional. Jacob nodded once, keeping a hand on the fence post, the other near the Leatherman on his belt. "We represent a private security firm. We've been tracking a specific military asset, MWD 924. We have reason to believe it's currently in your possession." Jacob's jaw tightened. "I didn't realize dogs were assets to be tracked like stolen equipment." The man offered a thin smile. "He's a valuable resource. We're prepared to compensate you handsomely for transferring ownership. No questions asked. We can even throw in a replacement, fully trained." Jacob didn't blink. "Not for sale." A silence hung in the air. The second man shifted, clearly annoyed. "Sir, you may not understand the scope of what's involved here." "I understand perfectly," Jacob interrupted, voice hardening. "And I've buried men for a lot less than threatening a dog on my land." The men exchanged a glance, then, without another word, returned to the SUV and drove off. Jacob watched until the taillights vanished over the ridge. That night, just past midnight, a sharp noise woke him. Not thunder, not wind, metal bending. Then the faintest sound of hooves pounding dirt. Jacob bolted upright, shotgun in hand, and ran toward the barn. The flames had already taken hold by the time he got there. Orange and blue licked the edges of the wooden roof, casting erratic shadows against the snow. One stall door hung open, but the others were closed. 4 horses trapped inside. Jacob cursed, rushing toward the side gate, but before he reached it, a black blur shot past him. Ranger. The shepherd's body moved like smoke low, fast, unafraid. He threw himself at the latch with his shoulder, teeth gnashing at the bolt. Inside the stall, the youngest colt kicked wildly, screaming. Jacob joined him, slamming his shoulder into the door. It gave way, the colt stumbling out into the cold. Smoke rolled out behind it. In the chaos, Ranger had already moved to the next stall, barking sharply. His voice rang out like a command, not a cry. The flames were creeping along the rafters now, heat so intense Jacob could barely breathe. He opened another door, the mare inside bolting into the night. Ranger barked again short, controlled herding the last 2 toward the pasture's edge. Only when the final horse was free did Jacob notice the blood. Ranger's side was torn, likely from a falling beam, his leg dragging slightly. Still, the dog circled the barn, checking, watching, holding ground. By the time fire trucks arrived, summoned by a neighbor who saw the glow from 3 miles away, Ranger was collapsed in the snow, breath labored but posture unbroken. Jacob knelt beside him, blood soaking into the knees of his jeans. "I've got you," he whispered. "You did good." Dr. Lily Hargrave arrived not long after the last ember died. Her eyes were red from the wind or maybe something else. She dropped to her knees without a word and began treating Ranger, wrapping the wound in clean gauze, checking his pulse. "He's stable," she said finally. "But we'll need to keep him under observation for a few days." "The leg's bad." Jacob nodded, his face a stone. "I'm filing this," Lily added. "Arson, Attempted theft of a federal asset. Endangerment. The sheriff's going to need a full statement, and I'm not letting this get buried. Sheriff Alan Grady arrived before dawn. A grizzled man in his 60s with a silver mustache and sharp eyes. He'd known Jacob's family for decades and didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Hell of a mess," he muttered, stepping over a scorched beam. "Got any names?" Jacob handed him the partial plate number he'd memorized. Black SUV, 2 men, private security. They knew about Ranger. Grady nodded, chewing the inside of his cheek. "We'll run it." Later that morning, Lily returned with a copy of the field report and photos of Ranger's injuries. She handed them to Grady without comment. The sheriff scanned them, then looked up slowly. "This dog saved 4 lives last night," he said, "and it looks like this isn't the first time." He turned to Jacob. "You think this goes up the chain?" Jacob met his gaze. "I think it starts there." Grady nodded again. "Then I'll make some calls." By sundown, Ranger was resting on a blanket inside the house, his wound clean, his breathing slow but even. Jacob sat on the floor beside him, one hand resting gently on his side. Outside, the remains of the barn still smoked, but the sky above was clear. And somewhere beyond that, wheels had begun to turn. The small animal hospital in Jackson, Wyoming, didn't look like much from the outside, just a squat tan building with snow-stained siding and a wooden porch wrapped in thick chains of Christmas lights that no one had taken down. But inside, behind double-locked doors and guarded by 2 off-duty deputies, the recovery room had been turned into a makeshift fortress. At the center of it all lay Ranger, the German shepherd who'd once been labeled untrainable, unfit, and disposable. He slept now under a thick wool blanket, his injured leg bandaged, IV fluid dripping steadily into his paw. His chest rose and fell with effort, but he was alive. Each breath was a defiance. Each twitch of his ear, a promise. Jacob sat in the corner of the room, unshaven and bone-tired, but his eyes stayed locked on the dog. He hadn't left since they brought Ranger in. His flannel shirt was wrinkled, boots tracked with dry straw and ash, but he looked more grounded than he had in years. News traveled fast in towns like Maple Hollow. By the second day, the story had moved beyond the county line. On the third, the trucks started rolling in. The first to arrive was Samuel Brooks, a retired Army colonel turned investigative journalist. Samuel was in his early 60s, tall and wiry, with dark skin weathered from decades in the field. He wore a felt hat and a parka missing its zipper. A Gulf War veteran, Samuel had made a reputation for exposing military injustice quietly but relentlessly. "You must be Jacob," he said, extending a hand. His voice was gravel and tobacco. "I've been following the scent of this story since Fort Hollister." Behind him came Anna Caldwell, a freelance war reporter with cropped silver blonde hair and a limp in her right leg. She'd covered conflicts in Syria, Ukraine, and the Congo. Sharp-tongued and soft-spoken, Anna had once embedded with K-9 units in Iraq. She carried her press badge like a shield. They weren't alone. Over the next 48 hours, 4 more former handlers, 3 veterinarians, and a national defense lawyer named Margaret Tatea, stocky redhead with a firm handshake and no patience for nonsense, arrived at Jacob's ranch. It wasn't just a visit, it was an uprising. The group worked in shifts, Samuel compiling Ranger's records, Anna filming interviews, Margaret building a legal case. Sheriff Grady provided copies of the incident report and security footage from the night of the fire. Lily Hargrave, now acting as Ranger's primary care vet, brought in medical documentation detailing the abuse signs. When Ranger finally stood on all fours again a week and a half after the fire, the room went silent. He limped, but he didn't fall. His eyes scanned the familiar faces. Jacob, Lily, the other handlers who now spoke to him with the same cadence of those he'd once served beside. He didn't growl. He didn't flinch. He wagged his tail, just once. That single moment, caught on video by Anna's camera, would go viral within days. By the end of the month, the group had drafted a formal petition titled Operation Worthy Warrior. The campaign demanded the Department of Defense declassify and audit the Enhanced Response Training Program, issue public recognition for dogs like Ranger, and implement mandatory psychological evaluations before any canine could be marked for retirement or euthanasia. The petition reached 250, zero signatures in a week. Veterans from across the country began sending messages handlers who had lost their dogs, soldiers who remembered a canine saving their life, families who'd adopted retired canines and now questioned what their animals had endured. News stations began airing clips. National papers picked up the story. Congress called for a preliminary hearing. Ranger was moved home after 2 weeks, still limping but stronger. The barn had been rebuilt in record time, thanks to volunteer crews from town and neighboring counties. And on a cold, clear morning, Jacob stood beneath the new beam and hung a hand-painted sign above the doorway. Worthy Hearts Sanctuary. It wasn't just a barn, no, it was a beginning. A place for dogs like Ranger, discarded by the system that once praised them, to find peace. Jacob converted the hayloft into kennels. Lily set up a small examination room. Samuel secured a monthly grant from a nonprofit, and Ranger, scarred and graying, became the first resident. Soon, more arrived. Duke, a retired explosives dog with a damaged spine, arrived from Texas. Nina, a black lab who'd developed a crippling fear of helicopters, came from a Marine base in North Carolina. Each of them brought ghosts, and each found something in the silence of Jacob's land and Ranger's quiet presence that allowed them to stay. Jacob changed too. He began writing again notes, short letters to former squad mates, updates on the dogs. He spoke at a local school on Veterans Day, something he'd never done before. When asked why he started the sanctuary, he simply said, because he deserved better. And so do they. Ranger would never fully recover from the injuries. His leg healed, but he walked with a permanent hitch. Some nights he still trembled in his sleep, but he no longer stared into the void. He met visitors at the fence line. He lay beside new arrivals in their first nights. And every evening, he returned to the porch steps, sitting at Jacob's side to watch the sun set behind the white-tipped ridges of Maple Hollow. He had gone from a ghost to a guardian, from an asset to a legend. If this story touched your heart, don't let it stop here. Share it with a friend, a veteran, a dog lover. Let the world know that behind every scar, there is a story worth honoring. That loyalty, whether from man or dog, should never be forgotten. Leave a comment below if you believe every warrior, bow-legged, or four deserves a second chance. And if you've ever been saved, by love, by hope, by an unexpected companion, tell us. You never know who needs to hear it. Hit like to honor Ranger and those like him. Subscribe to stand with every silent soldier who can't tell their story but deserves to be heard. Together, we can be the voice for those who once stood silently by our side.